For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Hello, welcome to our next episode of the English at Leeds Trinity podcast. And the title of this episode is K is for Kings. I'm Richard Storer. I'm a lecturer in English at Leeds Trinity, and in our podcast we are working our way through the alphabet, thinking of interesting things that begin with each letter of the alphabet, things to do with literature, things to do with language, creativity, with culture, with history, anything that interests us under the heading of English. Now, we're not actually sitting on the ground, but are here in the studio, and I'm very pleased that joining me today are, first of all, Professor Oz Hardwick.
Hello.
Welcome. And then welcome back to Hannah.
Hello.
And then we're also joined by Dr. Edwin Stockdale, who is a research fellow at our Leeds Centre for Victorian Studies.
Hello.
Welcome all three. Thank you very much for being part of this episode. What we're wanting to think about is all the different ways in which perhaps kings, or the idea of kings and the stories of kings, can still sort of capture our imagination. I've the greatest respect for King Charles III, but I think if you were to look objectively at the way society works, you might say he doesn't really have a very large part to play in the way all the things that affect our lives. So he's sort of a fairly marginal figure as a 21st century king. And yet if you looked at 21st century culture and language and at all the literature that we find interesting, then you might say that kings actually play a much larger part than might be justified by the part that the actual king plays. And so it's that I really want to explore. And I thought we might start just by thinking about our relationship to the idea of kings and the history particularly of kings of England, I guess, especially. I mean, I'll start by saying where I'm coming from with this. When I was a boy, somebody gave me a kind of wall chart which had on it a sort of list of all the different kings of England. It somehow, I think, went back to the Anglo-Saxon ones, and then it was like House of Plantagenet, House of Tudor, House of Stuart, and all those. So although I wouldn't say I learned it all, I spent quite a lot of time just idly staring at it. And I think that sort of created in my mind this kind of framework of kings being interesting individuals. And I've always, I think, since then had a bit of a sense of, I like to kind of think about where each one fits into the kind of history. Now, I'll go straight to you, Edwin. What about you? Where are you coming from in terms of history with kings?
So I always liked history right from when I was small. My parents both liked history. I definitely had a wooden ruler that had all the things on it.
Okay.
In a list, a bit like your board.
Indeed. And didn't you say you also have a tote bag?
I do. I've got a tote bag that I still use that has all the kings and queens.
Right. Yeah. So it's not only, it's part of our culture is all our king accessories, isn't it? That we have.
Yeah.
So that's left a bit of an impression on you. And Hannah, you've said, I think, every time you've been in one of our podcasts, how much you like history.
Yeah, I love history, yeah.
And do kings play a part in that?
A huge part, yeah. I think just growing up with the fairy tales that I've grown up with and horrible histories and things like that.
Yeah, of course.
History has always been something that we learn about, and kings always come up, of course. And I've always found them very interesting.
I think, as you mentioned there, with horrible histories, kings are not only kind of serious historical subjects, but they are figures around which you could have, inevitably a lot of kind of fun accumulates around them, as well as we're perhaps going to see later on.
Yeah, they're kind of like caricatures of what impressions we have of the kings that we've had.
Yeah.
Henry VIII as well.
Yes, indeed, yes. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. And Oz, what about you?
Quite the opposite. As a child, I didn't have any sense of interest in history at all, I'm afraid to say, although, or not in an abstract sort of fashion. I was interested in local history. And so as everyone else has been putting forward their relationship with kings, I was thinking about where mine started. And certainly I remember going to some sort of tourist attraction and no idea what it was. And I spoke to my mother about this years later, and she couldn't quite remember. But it was a very sort of green-lit, spooky sort of room that had a rock in the middle of it with a sword sticking out of it. And I knew that if I pulled it out, I would get to be king. And I failed, hence being here now, but I did get a plastic sword for my trouble. But, I mean, the serious part of this is that I don't remember where I knew stories of King Arthur from, but my earliest memory connected with them is of already knowing. And I think it is part of that sort of cultural depth that you have in stories. And coming from the West Country, of course, many areas claim King Arthur, but obviously we're right. And so he's very much a sort of a west of the Tamar hero. And I guess I grew up with a passion for the stories of King Arthur from that.
So it's been more mythical king rather than the list of actual kings.
Symbolic in many ways, because I was thinking of the other kings you think of earlier on, and the first king probably you hear about, so old King Cole, who's a merry old soul. And it's that sense of somebody around which things happen.
Yes.
Rather than all the sort of the politics of kingship and so on. Yeah. So it's that idea of a sort of a core of narrative and episode, I guess. And that's what I've always found interesting, that sort of symbolic nature of kings.
Yeah. Well, I hope we're going to, in part of this conversation, we're going to kind of dip into some examples of how people have written about kings and responded to all that. And while we're still thinking about the tables of kings and queens, of course, on my chart there was no King Arthur. I must have probably once or twice looked and thought, where is he then? Before I realised what the difference was between Arthur and the others. We were looking back through the list, and I made the interesting discovery that a word which I thought had always been pronounced sobriquet is actually pronounced sobriquet. But either way, it means nickname or kind of name that attaches to kings. And we were thinking about actually not that many English kings have got a sobriquet, but a few did come to mind. Alfred the Great is one. Bloody Mary, I suppose, is another. Any others?
Oh, we came up with some.
Everyone's like
Edward the Confessor.
Edward the Confessor, indeed. And
William Rufus and William the Conqueror.
William the Conqueror. So there's actually two in a row there that did have it, as if they were trying to get something going. But then it didn't really. The next one, Henry I, he hasn't got one, has he? So that's it. Well, I was looking, and it seems that we have not done as well as the French with their kings. As if you look for a list of French kings, almost all of them up to about the early modern period have got a fantastic or intriguing sobriquet, like Charles the Bald, Louis the Do-Nothing. Philip.
I've never heard of that.
I know.
It's not Marlowe Boy, is it really?
Philip,
related to Dr. Doolittle.
Yeah. Philip the Bold might be more than one you might think is a good one. Charles the Fat, and also Louis the Fat. But we're saying that might actually be supposed to be a bit more of a good thing than it might seem to us.
Yeah, who knows? It could be that's it could be that sort of sense of fat of the land or something.
Yeah,
it could be bounty or
yeah,
something.
everybody ate well during his reign. Yeah, and we've got Philip the Amorous.
That sounds very French.
Yeah, indeed. And what about this? Louis the Quarreller. And Charles the Affable. So that's obviously a nice one. A nice one to be. So it's kind of curious that they've got this history of labelling them all with this sobriquet. Anyway, we're going to dip into some English kings now, starting with one, Hannah, that you said you were particularly interested in, who does have actually the most famous of all, I think, sobriquet nicknames. Who's that?
Ethelred the Unready. Some people say Ethelred as well. I think both pronunciations are fine. I don't know if historians are kind of debate it.
Yeah, I was quite impressed when you said Ethelred. I'm thinking,
Is it the A and the E?
It's the A. It's the ash, isn't it?
Yes.
So Ethelred is right, isn't it?
I would have thought so. Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, horrible histories. I've had lots of fun with with him, as have many other people through the centuries, for being called the Unready. So what is actually the story behind, why is he called the Unready?
I think in the 1180s he was given his name, so after he died, but it's sort of broken into two parts. So Athel is like noble, and red in Old English is advice or counsel. So his name kind of, with his nickname, is like nobly advised, the badly advised, or well prepared, the unprepared. Kind of, it
Right.
negates itself. It's like a sarcastic name.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in fact, the word that sounds to us like unready is not really got anything to do with the idea of ready.
Yeah.
It's actually a word that has disappeared, which is, again, it comes down to the difference between a and e, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's not another word that's to do with advice.
Yeah, and I think so. His father was Edgar the Peaceful, so
right.
I think it follows, the peaceful, and then the unready. It just shows sort of the awful invasions from the Vikings and everything. It shows how he was genuinely unprepared for everything.
Right. So yes. So
But due to ill advice.
to ill advice. Yeah. So actually, the wrong meaning of unready kind of inevitably comes back to him. You can't help but see his reign in that way, because the main feature of it was that basically he was constantly under attack from the Vikings.
Yeah, and he used bribery with money instead of fighting, so they ended up taking over £47,000 worth of gold from him.
Right.
And I think some people assume that he's called the Unready because he had an older brother that was deemed illegitimate, and I think he died, so Ethelred became king. So people seem to think that that's why he became Ethelred the Unready, but that's actually because of the Viking invasions.
Yes. Yeah. So it's to do with his not being well advised, or perhaps.
There's a 14th century poem about Richard II called Richard the Raiderless as well.
Oh, raiderless. Yes.
So it's the one who doesn't take advice.
Yeah, that word raid, which I suppose is how you pronounce it, meaning advice. And I was looking it up in the OED, and I see that Tolkien actually uses it. He's kind of brought it back into one of his stories, trying to kind of bring it back.
Right, I can't think of where he does that, but
well,
yeah.
He probably does.
Yeah, I only know that because it's in the OED, so I wouldn't have. I never would have found it otherwise. But so actually, Ethelred is someone who gives us a little lesson in the history of the English language.
Yeah.
Besides and so after he died, then in fact the Danes actually took over the country, didn't they, for a while, under King Canute?
Yeah. So what he did was he went on a bit of a rampage in the country in England, and slaughtered lots of Danes that had already been there for ages, and a lot of them were innocent people. And one of them was the daughter of King Sweyn from, I think it was Sweyn Forkbeard. And then he came to England and then exiled Ethelred, who hid in Normandy. So then, Sweyn was crowned king after him.
Right.
And then King Canute followed after that.
Right. So if you want a kind of English king, then it wasn't a great reign, because he kind of... But who's to say which was really better? I don't know. Anyway, right, okay, thank you. That started us off in that kind of Anglo-Saxon period, but obviously that's where perhaps all our ideas about kingship really kind of start, isn't it? All the different kings, and kings taking over from other kings, and kings fighting other kings, and so on. If we just kind of go forward a bit then, I thought maybe, Edwin, we'd come to you next. We're going to get out of our historical sequence, but the king that you're particularly interested in is one that maybe is not so familiar to people, Edward II. Do you want to say a bit about why you're interested in Edward II and what we need to know about him?
Yeah. So Edward II, I think, is really fascinating because he completely divides people, because he's known for not being a very good king, which is probably fair because he wasn't really interested in being a king. He had quite a lot of older brothers and sisters who died. So he was the last one to be born, and when all the others were dead, he had to be king.
Right.
Yeah, he wasn't. He was interested in being outdoors a lot. He did a lot of thatching and digging, and planting gardens and orchards. All things that a medieval king shouldn't really be interested in.
So he kind of really just wanted to live a kind of outdoor country life.
Yeah, and he's also quite contradictory because he, as well as the outdoor life, he loved clothes and fine fashions as well. Yeah, and he had his male favourites as well.
Right.
Or lovers,
Right.
even though historians disagree about them. But yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's another thing that is sort of one of the main things that's sort of attached to him, isn't it? And he was, as a king, he was actually forcibly overthrown, and
He was overthrown by his wife, acting for his son, who became Edward III. But then Edward III overthrew Queen Isabella and ruled in his own right when he came of age.
Right, yes.
So yeah, he was overthrown by his own wife.
Okay. It's quite a big kind of...
On behalf of his son.
On behalf of his son. That's quite what you might call a bit of a dysfunctional family situation, isn't it?
Awkward dinners.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, is really like Game of Thrones, really.
Yeah.
Indeed, which is the whole relevant thing, isn't it? Because, the whole success of that is because of all this, isn't it? It's because of how much we kind of still find that all that sort of thing so fascinating. So, I mean, that scenario you've just described is very much the kind of thing that a scriptwriter is immediately going to latch onto. I think you've actually written some poems about Edward II, haven't you? Do you want to give us what's part of your study of him?
Yeah. I've just finished writing a book of poems about Edward II and Queen Isabella, and their lives. But yeah, I'll read this one. It's from early on in the book. It's called The Threshold of Autumn, and it's set at Langley in Hertfordshire. That was one of his manors. It's now called King's Langley, but it was called Langley
right.
then.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
And it's the moment when Edward meets Piers Gaveston. The Threshold of Autumn, Edward II. You are thatching a roof for the watermill when he arrives, Piers Gaveston, not as tall as you, athletic. You are captured by his large green eyes like rushes on the River Gade. Your Grace, he says, and you take in his irreverent smile. You notice he is looking at your torso, tanned with a dusting of hair. You blush. Later you take Gaveston rowing on the river, pointing out the ditches you dug, the orchards you tend. Gaveston ruffles your hair. You want to skin his clothes, lick the hollow of his throat, kiss the curve of his hips. You would know every bone in his body. You could not be other than you are.
Thank you. So that's really kind of exploring the thing about Edward that was like, didn't really fit with him being the king, that sort of, or that in his society at the time didn't fit his sexuality and his, how he had various favourites who were also his lovers.
Yeah, absolutely. And also he was really interested in the ordinary people in his kingdom. Like if he was out and about, he would always talk to people on the fields. Yeah, and he would go swimming in the rivers, even in the middle of winter. So what you could say was a wild swimmer before it was fashionable.
Okay. Which that would be difficult for even a king today to kind of do very much of that, wouldn't it? Then Edward II, of course, is the subject of a famous play by Shakespeare's contemporary Christopher Marlowe. You can read something from there.
I thought I would read a bit from the very first scene because Edward II's father, Edward I, banished Gaveston because they were becoming too close. And when Edward I dies, the first thing his son does is to recall Gaveston, which is where the play starts. And I thought I'd read the beginning of the play because the beginning of the play is full of classical imagery that makes it clear that Edward and Gaveston are lovers, and the audience of Elizabethan England would know this from the language used. Sweet Prince, I come. These thy amorous lines might have enforced me to have swum from France, and, like Leander, gasped upon the sand, so thou wouldst smile and take me in thy arms. Music and poetry is his delight. Therefore I'll have Italian masques by night, sweet speeches, comedies, and pleasing shows, and in the day when he shall walk abroad, like sylvan nymphs my pages shall be clad. My men like satyrs grazing on the lawns shall with their goat feet dance an antic hay. Sometime a lovely boy in Dian's shape, with hair that gilds the water as it glides, crownets of pearl about his naked arms, and in his sportful hands an olive tree, to hide those parts which men delight to see, shall bathe him in a spring, and there hard by, one like Actaeon peeping through the grove, shall by the angry goddess be transformed, and running in the likeness of an art, by yelping hounds pulled down, and seen to die. Such things as these best please his majesty.
That's quite a powerful opening, isn't it, of the play? Thank you.
Indeed, yeah.
Thank you. I was going to go on now to just slightly back in history, because on the subject of sort of kings who struggled because they just did not fit the kind of expectations, particularly of the people who were closest to them in terms of like other powerful people in the kingdom. And the one that I'm particularly interested in is Edward II's grandfather, Henry III, who actually reigned for 50 years. So he was one of the longest reigning monarchs, but he's not really that well remembered because he was, relatively speaking, a failure. And compared to the kings who in the medieval period were considered a success, like Henry V or Edward I or Henry II, he wasn't. And it was partly, again, to do with him just not being interested in the things that were expected of him. He didn't really like going to war. So if he did go to war, it would be like he just kind of, in France, he would take the army here and there, but always avoid actually meeting the other army. And then after a while, he would sort of say, well, I really want to go home now. And he would go, he would go home. What he liked doing was, interior design and having Westminster Abbey built. And also was very pious. He had a huge cult of Edward the Confessor. So he regarded Edward the Confessor as his kind of patron saint. And he also did things like feeding thousands of paupers at every kind of festival. So he would basically say, get in 5,000 paupers and feed them, which is quite hard to imagine quite how they organised that. But that was what he liked doing, which is great in kind of modern terms, but just sort of didn't get things done in sort of medieval terms. And in terms of literature, he does not feature that much, but he does have one moment in Shakespeare, one scene in Shakespeare's play King John, which is the last scene when King John, who was Henry III's father, is dying. And at that point, Prince Henry actually makes an appearance and sort of expresses distress at seeing his father so unhappy. And Shakespeare gives him some really nice lines, even though actually he was only 9 years old when this happened. So it's pretty eloquent for a 9-year-old. But one of the things that Prince Henry says as King John is kind of on his deathbed is, I am the signet to this pale faint swan, who chants a doleful hymn to his own death, and from the organ pipe of frailty sings his soul and body to their lasting rest. And then King John has these quite sort of graphic lines, I think, about how, because he's eaten something that disagrees with him, and that's what's killing him, I think. There is so hot a summer in my bosom that all my bowels crumble up to dust. I am a scribbled form drawn with a pen upon a parchment, and against this fire do I shrink up. And then he does actually die, and Prince Henry, who's now about to become King Henry III, says, "Even so must I run on, and even so stop. What surety of the world, what hope, what stay, when this was now a king, and now is clay?" So again, that kind of reflecting on the kind of what exactly is kingship, when after all, king is just a man. And there's again that sort of mismatch really between the role of the king and the actual reality. The other really interesting story I think about King Henry III is that as later in his life, all the kind of nobles around him, especially Simon de Montfort, who was a very powerful warrior and noble in Henry's kingdom, just got so fed up with him not being able to sort of do the things they wanted him to do, that they basically took over and kind of reorganised the constitution so that they were kind of running things, which eventually led to a civil war as Henry's son kind of fought back. But Henry was captured by de Montfort, and so was kind of a prisoner in de Montfort's camp when Edward, Henry's son, arrived with his army to fight the Battle of Evesham against de Montfort and defeat him. And so Henry was kind of stuck inside, he was a kind of old man by then, stuck inside a suit of armour on the wrong side and in the middle of a group of people who were about to be attacked and killed. So the story goes that he was kind of there in his armour, shouting out to anyone who could hear, "I am Henry of Winchester. I am your king. Do not kill me." Which is just so kind of, again, evocative of the kind of paradox of kingship, that nobody actually knew who he was. He had to say, "I'm your king, do not kill me." And that's quite a sort of memorable thing as well. So it's full of, his life is full of these interesting little things, I think. We've thought a bit about a couple of medieval kings. We've had Ethelred, we've had Edward II, we've had Henry III, and I thought now we would slightly switch attention to Oz, the king that you are interested in, which is the king who kind of never was. Or was he?
How long have we got? Funnily enough, at time of recording, and a couple of days ago, I was in my local newsagent, and on the front of the Daily Star, everyone's source of the most accurate news in the planet, there was news that the Holy Grail was in St Albans.
Oh.
Had a picture of Graham Chapman as King Arthur on the front. So he is real and he exists. A spurious connection, but I think it's just another example of how King Arthur's everywhere, pretty much. You know, front of the most red topped of the red tops. Only this week. Well, the thing about King Arthur is, whereas our other kings have been kings who perhaps didn't do what we want our kings to do, or certainly not at the time, I think Arthur's very much the king who's there because he does. And he's sort of lost in sort of pre-recorded chronicle stroke literature, and there's a lot of crossover in the early period of history and story as we'd separate them out now. But there's probably a character in the 5th or 6th century called Arthur. And about 300 years later, we get him mentioned in chronicles. And as we go along, this Arthur who's a war leader becomes Arthur who's a king, and Arthur with a son, and Arthur with a queen. And so over a period of about 300 years, we get this the character that we sort of know now, I suppose. And it's the character who I mentioned right at the start that captured my imagination before I realised my imagination was being captured. And throughout all this time, he becomes the first sort of extended narrative we have in the sort of first third of the 12th century with Geoffrey of Monmouth, who has his history of the kings, in which the greatest space is given to Arthur.
That history of the kings also mentions old King Cole, isn't it? That's where you get the images of that.
It has all manner of people that we don't remember anymore, but for some reason there is Arthur, and it's very much a chronicle of kings, but at the same time it's also the first British work in which we start getting the idea of sort of elaborate courts and rituals and so on. There's a court at Caerleon in it that's very much in the sort of modern idea of King Arthur stories. And so Arthur's very much the ideal king, and as his narrative, again thinking about England up to the sort of the Malory's monumental work in the later 15th century, becomes very much an ideal of kingship and the complexities of kingship, I suppose. And if there's one thing that goes through the several hundred pages of Malory's works, it's the idea of conflict between the personal and the greater good. For Arthur, for his knights, and the whole drama of it is driven by this trying to be the best you can, when perhaps in some ways the best is sort of divided in your loyalties to your companions, your loyalties to your family, or your loyalties to your country. So we all know something of the story of how it all ends with Lancelot, Guinevere and Arthur in this triangle, and each one of them has divided loyalties. Lancelot is devoted to Guinevere, but also to Arthur. Arthur is obviously devoted to his wife, but also to the idea of kingship. And Guinevere likewise is divided between Arthur and Lancelot. And they're incompatible things. And I suppose it's one of the things that sort of has stuck with me as I've grown up is not just the tensions about kingship, but about these conflicts that we all have to deal with throughout our whole lives. These things we're committed to more than 100%, if I may pick up the language of
workloads.
I was thinking of TV talent shows where people give 150% or something, because you feel like you're 100% committed to something, but you're also 100% committed to something else. And they're tension, what's best for you, what's best for work, what's best for your family, all these things that you don't want to give up on any of them. And I think those patterns are within the Arthurian stories. And Arthur, of course, is mourned as the great king who almost gets the perfect world, and it falls apart because of these divided loyalties. But also in the Arthurian stories, he's sort of just in the background a lot of the time. And he's the sort of figure that's sort of an umbrella figure in which all the other adventures happen, which again are very much divided up in terms of different people, different loyalties and so on throughout. That's what's fascinating to me about them.
He kind of comes back into the picture, doesn't he, at the end when he dies?
Yeah, people go off from Arthur's court and come back, and one of the mentions of it. I'm a great lover of Chaucer's work. At the beginning of The Wife of Bath's Tale, she introduces her story and says this was in the good old days of King Arthur, when the land was fulfilled of fairies. We think of Arthur as a medieval sort of character, and yet here in the 14th century, someone's saying, in the good old days of King Arthur, when everything was so much better. And so he is this sort of figure of the ideal, which of course gets picked up after Kennedy's assassination, to pick one example that people are talking about. His society being like Camelot. And indeed, there's rumours that he's not really dead and will come back. At the time, you get stories, this conspiracy theories like that, as with the Arthur who isn't dead and is sleeping under a hill in Scotland or in Owsley Edge or somewhere in Cornwall, and will come back when we need him most. So it's to do with who we are as human beings as much as the ideal of kingship.
I can see from that why lots of authors have chosen Arthur as the topic. I mean, Tennyson is in the 19th century particularly. I think Milton was thinking about doing a poem about
there was no market for that. So
then he switched, but it occurred to him, and lots of others. Are you going to read us a bit from Malory?
Yeah, I will do, yes. And I've got 2 copies of Malory here, and I think I'll go for the one that's in the Caxton edition, which is a little bit closer to modern English. And I'm sure this is something that's probably covered in one of the podcasts about once we start getting things printed, we start getting the standardization.
Well, we haven't done that yet, but we should do.
But yeah, I think P for printing.
Yeah.
So where might be a good point to start after Sir Lucan?
Sir Lucan dies, right. That's it.
Yeah, after Sir Lucan dies. Alas, said the king, this is to me a full heavy sight to see this noble duke so die for my sake, for he would have holpen me that had more need of help than I. Alas, he would not complain him, his heart was so set to help me. Now, Jesu have mercy upon his soul. Then Sir Bedivere wept for the death of his brother. Leave this mourning and weeping, said the king, for all this will not avail me. For wit thou well, and I might live myself, the death of Sir Lucan would grieve me evermore, but my time hieth fast, said the king. Therefore, said Arthur unto Sir Bedivere, take thou Excalibur, my good sword, go with it to yonder waterside, and when thou comest there, I charge thee, throw my sword in that water, and come again and tell me what thou there seest. My lord, said Bedivere, your commandment shall be done, and lightly bring you word again. So Sir Bedivere departed, and by the way he beheld that noble sword, that the pommel and the haft was all of precious stones. And then he said to himself, if I throw this rich sword in the water, thereof shall never come good, but harm and loss. And then Sir Bedivere hid Excalibur under a tree, and so, as soon as he might, he came again unto the king, and said he had been at the water, and had thrown the sword into the water. What saw thou there? Said the king. Sir, he said, I saw nothing but waves and winds. That is untruly said of thee, said the king. Therefore go thou lightly again, and do my commandment. As thou art to me lief and dear, spare not, but throw it in. Then Sir Bedivere returned again, and took the sword in his hand, and then him thought sin and shame to throw away that noble sword. And so eft he hid the sword, and returned again, and told to the king that he had been at the water, and done his commandment. What saw thou there? Said the king. Sir, he said, I saw nothing but the waters wap and the waves wan. Ah, traitor untrue, said King Arthur, now hast thou betrayed me twice. Who would have weened that? Thou hast been to me so lief and dear, and thou art named a noble knight, and would betray me for the richness of the sword. But now go again lightly, for thy long tarrieth puts me in great jeopardy of my life, for I have taken cold. But if thou do now as I bid thee, if ever I may see these, I shall slay thee with my own hands, for thou wouldst for my rich sword see me dead. Then Sir Bedivere departed, and went to the sword, and lightly took it up, and went to the waterside, and there he banged the girdle about the hilts, and then he threw the sword as far into the water as he might. And there came an arm and a hand above the water, and met it, and caught it, and so shook it thrice, and brandished, and then vanished away the hand with the sword in the water. So Sir Bedivere came again to the king, and told him what he saw. Alas, said the king, help me hence, for I dread me I have tarried over long. Then Sir Bedivere took the king on his back, and so went with him to the waterside. And when they were at the waterside, even fast by the bank hoved a little barge, with many fair ladies in it, and among them all was a queen, and all they had black hoods, and all they wept and shrieked when they saw King Arthur. And off he goes.
And off he goes, yes, leaving Sir Bedivere to kind
Sir
of
Bedivere around.
religious. Well, he
Can't help thinking why he didn't carry him to the water to watch him throw the sword in. But, however, 3 times, that famous 3 that we get in the Bible and in folk tales and all sorts, and throughout the Morte d'Arthur and so on, it takes 3 before he finally does the promise.
Yeah.
And
I love that scene so much because it has so many different things in it to do with the idea of kingship, particularly this sort of mystique that Arthur knows. He kind of has a special knowledge, being king, about what will happen and whether it has happened or not. And then he knows that there's someone coming to get him down at the... So he's got that sort of extra level of God-given vision. And yet Sir Bedivere hasn't. And so he sees things in a much more kind of pragmatic way.
Well, it's sort of pragmatic, but initially he's looking at the material value of the sword, and then the sort of symbolic value the second time. So he does move to an understanding towards throwing it. Yeah. And their understanding sort of comes together at the end, that actually it's not about how rich it is. It's sort of about the symbol of what it means, but ultimately it's about the reign of Arthur, and it has to go because it can't survive.
Right, yeah, it's coming to the end.
So it's a fascinating thing. And of course, with all our kings, we have symbols and things. And I know Edwin's written about Richard II and portraits and things he's holding and so on, and how you can interpret them. And I think there is that. We look at portraits of kings and indeed queens and holding orbs or scepters or swords, pens, all sorts of things. And it is, this is, it's law in different ways and status. And I think that piece of Malory really captures that.
Yeah. And also a more kind of comical level almost, the king's frustration, as it were, not being able to get the staff who will actually do what he asks them to do, which is another kind of aspect.
You've been dear to me and you're known as a noble knight, and yet just throw the sword in.
Yeah. Right. I mean, thinking about King Arthur, not a historical king, though there must have been somebody who gave rise to them. We have in our history actually come close several times to having a real King Arthur, of course, because when King John became king, he had to do so by kind of getting someone else out of the way, who was his nephew Arthur, who might have had an equally good claim. So if that hadn't happened, we would have had King Arthur then. And then, of course, Henry VIII, he had an older brother, Arthur, who would have been king, who married Catherine of Aragon, but unfortunately then died before anybody could be quite sure that he had actually consummated the marriage, thereby giving rise to all the kind of history that we know so well. And if all that hadn't happened, then we would have had the real King Arthur as well as the mythical King Arthur, and that would have been quite an interesting counterfactual thing.
If we go down to Winchester, we see the big wooden medieval round table, which right at the top we have the king, who is Henry VIII, because it was painted during his court. Right. It was Edward I, big fan of King Arthur, who had this table made, and then Henry VIII is, apart from his brother, by association, is buying into that mythology.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to the accessories, the symbolism, all those things. I think we're more or less, I think, come to the end of our time there. So I'd say we could go much more. We had much more material that we could have brought in, but I'll leave everyone who's listening to go away and find their own stories of kings and think who their favourite king is. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Edwin. What we haven't mentioned is, of course, that your name, Edwin, is the name of a very early king.
Yeah.
King of Northumbria, or was it,
Yeah,
I think?
King
Yeah,
of
and
Northumbria. That's who I am named after, because my dad is from Newcastle, and that's why my dad called me Edwin.
I see. Right. Okay, so that king from very long ago was important to them.
The ancient king.
Okay, that's a great note to end on, actually. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oz. And long live the king. Well, I got a bit carried away there with the stinger that we were using in that episode. That's called Medieval Fanfare, and that came from Free Sound, and we're grateful to Gertrude Hecker for the use of that. Let's have it one more time. And that's to announce that if you enjoyed Edwin's poem about Edward II, his new book of poems exploring different moments in the life of King Edward II is now out. That's called Winter Wolf, Poems Edwin Stockdale, and that is available from Red Squirrel Press. So thank you to Edwin for reading one of those poems for us. You can find out more about English at Leeds Trinity from the Leeds Trinity University website, www.leedstrinity.ac.uk, and also from the podcast channel on the At Leeds Trinity channel on YouTube. You can also now find us on Instagram at LTU_English and on TikTok at LTU English_. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Steve Oxon and FesleyanStudios.com for this music, which is called Rio After Dark.